This is your World War III Day X update. I'm going to level with you guys right now. If you don't like to think too much, I suggest that you click off the video and take your ass to the trending page right now. For the rest of you, let's get to it. Is NATO preparing a decapitation strike against the Kremlin? I'm going to provide you voluminous amounts of data that suggests that very thing. Let's start with the fact that in the last 24 hours, there have been 158 kamikaze unmanned aerial vehicle drones probing Russian airspace, looking for targets deep inside Russian territory, all the way into Moscow and St. Petersburg and beyond. Many of them with their sights set on government buildings, military installations, airstrips, elements of Russia's nuclear triad. Okay, 158 kamikaze drones. Now, 18 months ago, were I to tell you that just one of those drones entered Russian airspace, that would have been cause for alarm. But because we've mission creeped our way very perniciously into this situation we now find ourselves in, where nuclear war is closer than at any period throughout the Cold War. Let me say that again. Nuclear war, right now, we are closer to it than at any time throughout the Cold War. And yet, do we have the same corresponding culture of preparedness we did at that time? Do we have even duck and cover anymore? I mean, duck and cover was arguably better than go inside, stay inside, and wait 20 years until the government can rebuild the brainwashing media apparatus. Now, we are truly in a situation where people are so incredibly desensitized to what is going on. And trust me, I went to a family get-together over the weekend. People have zero fucking idea what is going on in the world. And if that's my family, then I can imagine that many of your families, which is not to say maybe many of them are more informed than mine, but let's just put it this way, people are busy just trying to pay the damn bills. They don't have time to focus on this stuff. People do not realize how close we actually are, which is insane. So these 158 kamikaze drones, the other purpose that they're simultaneously collecting data and probing Russian air defenses. Air defenses like this. This is in Moscow. They have a multi-layered defense system comprised of Pantsers, S-300, S-400 systems that protect their biggest city, okay? And this is the case all throughout Russia. But what Ukraine is doing is collecting a data set which likely will leverage artificial intelligence, and they're compiling all of this data on the pathways of these drones that they take and finding the optimal way to circumnavigate Russia's air defense system. Here is a map of all of the targets. This is just the critical infrastructure. This is not the military bases and the airstrips, okay? These are all of the oil refineries that Ukraine has struck thus far, which is causing immense amount of economic damage for Russia, I should add. Contrary to what a lot of the Russophiles might claim, it's having an effect. It's causing a rising price in gas prices because the bottleneck is in the refinement process, and Ukraine intelligently is targeting the oil refineries as opposed to where it comes out of the ground, okay? Because that is one of the more challenging and expensive parts of the process, arguably, and there's just a lot more moving parts, so to speak. So increasingly, as these drones are making their ways and finding different routes, all of that data is being collected and likely being put into some sort of virtual version, rendition of Russian airspace. And as it is an evolving situation, Russia is moving stuff around, they're adapting, they're putting cope cages and fortifications on things and moving their air defenses around, going on heightened states of alert in certain regions. It's ever changing, but at the same time, they get to build out this simulacrum of Russian airspace. And they're relaying that information to NATO. If you are Russia, you have to presume that they're relaying that information to NATO. Why? Because this is what NATO is doing. Kaliningrad, a Boeing RC-135W rivet joint flying around Kaliningrad on a daily basis. Here in the eastern part of Poland, we have Boeing KC-135R Stratotankers and countless other reconnaissance and surveillance planes, not a refueling plane. We have a Boeing E-3B Sentry flying in the Arctic, just north of what looks like Finland and Sweden. We have a Northrop Grumman RQ-4B Global Hawk doing its rounds around Lithuania. And we have this same scenario playing out in the Baltic states, along the Belarusian border, in the Baltic Sea, up around Finland, where they're doubling the fences, all with the target of trying to assist Ukraine in these deep strikes into Russia. And this is, whether it's true or not, this is what the Russians have to presume, that NATO is creating a map for when day X arrives, that they will be able to effectively target as much of Russia's nuclear triad. Let me see if I have a picture of that very thing. Here's another one. This is where they're building their Skyfall nuclear-powered nuclear missile that can circumnavigate the planet a couple times, allegedly. Okay? So they're starting, all of these are probing operations, guys. So even when the drone gets shot down, it's kind of like a Tesla. When you're doing full self-driving, I have full self-driving, and when you have to correct the vehicle, you think, oh, well, that was an error, right? But that gets sent back to the mothership, and it figures out, okay, why did you turn that way? What was in the system that was inherently wrong? And then it corrects it. So even when the drones are shot down, and these are pretty cheap drones, the same attritional disproportionality that's present in the Middle East, where you have, Israel spending 50 to 100K to shoot down a $500 drone, something similar is happening in Russia. And so the more of these drones Ukraine can throw at Russia, the more money Russia has to expend. And even when Russia shoots down those drones, a few things are happening. And I'm no expert on this, but I would presume that in addition to mapping out, where the strong points and weak points are, NATO is also getting information about Russia's radars, Russia's missile defense systems themselves, and the signatures that they use, and their electronic warfare capabilities. Case in point, electronic warfare. In fact, one of these Global Hawks was brought down. Not brought down, but it lost contact with the operator for an extended period of time in Estonia just the other day. The American RQ-4B Global Hawk recon plane was performing a recon flight near the Russian border, but during the operation it signaled that it had lost contact with the operator and began to move chaotically in the airspace. So people presume that Russia was using electronic warfare there, and rightly so, when NATO is invading your country. Now, some people take issue with that, okay? Some people take issue when I say that NATO is invading Russia. Now, it might be a semantic game, but let's just look at the reality of the situation. NATO funding. Were it not for NATO funding, Russia would have won this war a long time ago. Were it not for NATO weapons that are now been given the green light to use in the territory that is currently being invaded, and now the Biden administration, what the hell is going on with that? Anyways, whoever is in charge is mulling over whether or not to allow Ukraine to do deep strikes into Moscow. Yes, Moscow. Okay, they're actually thinking about it. And Poland is getting ready to shoot down missiles over Western Ukraine airspace. And it's not even a question of whether they're going to do it. They're going to do it, okay? So all the while, you have these things happening, and I lost my train of thought because this is just so insane. So yes, NATO ISR, NATO Mercs, NATO weaponry, NATO funding, NATO command and control, NATO guys being given early leave so that they can join the PMCs that are going to go there and fight on Ukraine's behalf, and et cetera, all of the data which is being assimilated into NATO's AI that they're now leveraging, in fact, in Kursk. Okay, they're using this technology already. So the Russians must presume that NATO is getting ready to do a decapitation strike. Now, is this why they are, and we do have some video footage of some of these attacks, and it's not only kinetic, it's also cyber, okay? Russia is going to change the foundations of their nuclear deterrence policy. I talked about this a couple days ago. In fact, I warned about this a long time ago. But now it's for real, for reals. We're going to talk about the details of that in just a moment. But I want to remind people that this is not just, you know, when I talk about the exponential growth of Ukrainian UAVs, attacks against Russia, you could plot it in a graph, okay? Because, again, 18 months ago, the thought of one drone making it deep into Russian airspace, targeting a Russian airbase, was big news. Not anymore. So the frequency of these attacks is increasing, the intensity of attacks is increasing, and the amount, the quantity of attacks are also increasing in terms of how many drones are being fired at once. What this means is that Russia's options are starting to dwindle. Now, some people might disagree with what I'm about to say, but the parity between Ukraine and Russian capabilities, it's a gap that is closing. Because as NATO introduces more advanced weapons, they don't want to give Ukraine too much because there's always the risk that some rogue pilot flies an F-16 into Russia and, you know, for $100 million or whatever, right? So they got to be careful, and they don't want the Ukrainians to be turncoats at some point because they know that the revolution is probably going to happen at some point there, and the Ukrainians are going to start fighting in the other direction. At least that's what I think is going to happen if the Russians are successful. NATO needs to be very careful because as parity starts to happen, now they have F-16s, nowhere near as capable, arguably, as an Su-57, and up against an S-400. It's likely not going to last too long. But regardless, what I'm trying to say is they're starting to get more enabled to do deeper and deeper strikes. Russia's options become more limited, okay? So we're approaching a situation where Russia's economy is starting to suffer. I mean, their stock market is down, inflation is up, gasoline prices are up as a result of this refinement business. And remember, all economies really fundamentally what dictates inflation is the price of fuel, because that's the basis of everything, how much energy it takes. So if Russian oil prices and gas prices are going up, everything in the economy is going to go up. That means Russia gets pushed into a corner more and more and more. As these drone strikes continue to ramp up, and here's Ukraine's warning to Russia, if Russia thinks that the strikes on infrastructure carried out by Ukraine are temporary, then Moscow is wrong. Our strikes will only increase in intensity. We did not start this war, but we definitely will end it. Now, is that just tough talk, blusterous, psychological warfare on the part of the Ukrainians? It's possible, but the numbers bear that out. That every other day I'm coming on here and saying that we have a record amount of drone strikes into Russian territory, all of which, even if they all get shot down, it's a win from the Ukrainian point of view because they're taking that information back to Uncle Sam, who is, putting it into their calculus. And remember, all of those warships, the brunt of the U.S. Navy, currently not too far from Russia and the Caspian Sea and Iran. So they must be taking this into account. If I'm thinking about this, I assure you the Russian MOD is definitely thinking about this. Just the simple fact that, people are oblivious to what's going on when we are the closest to a nuclear war than we've ever been before, in contrast to the Cold War, where there was enhanced public awareness and preparedness and movements against nuclear proliferation and these sorts of things. Even though we have less amount of nukes, and that's the only thing that is less at this point in time is the amount of nuclear weapons. I think at its peak, there was like 70,000 in the possession of just the Soviets. So even though we're down to like 6,000 or so each between the Americans and the Russians, it doesn't matter. I mean, you know, all it takes is one really to cause a big panic on the planet and whip things into a frenzy, and then it only takes a few hundred to create catastrophic consequences and wipe out a significant portion of the global population. So just the fact that, you know, the complacency level is there. This is why it's so, and this is not just me saying this, this is the experts. I know some people throw shade on the, Brian Keating doesn't like the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists because he thinks it's a bunch of charlatans and they're just kind of, you know, they're just sort of making things up and using this kind of alarmism in order to sell their silly clock idea. Regardless, we are closer to nuclear. I mean, all of the experts agree that we're closer. Yet, at the same time, people are completely disinterested in the idea, which is incredibly scary because that only means that the likelihood of it occurring is greater and greater. In addition to Ukraine's threats to ramp up attacks, okay, so we know in the run-up to the election, and this is going to be another thing that is going to add to the exponential increase in escalation, because up until this point we've seen horizontal escalation more or less. But as Russia's options dwindle, as the US election approaches, as winter approaches for Ukraine, and as Ukraine does more and more drone strikes, all of these things, if you were to plot it on a graph, start to point towards vertical escalation. And vertical escalation means that at some point or another, Russia will have no other alternative but to leverage their escalation dominance in the form of non-conventional weaponry. And now the Russians are even claiming that the West, and they've been claiming this for some time, the biological warfare bit about how Ukraine is being leveraged to create gene-specific, ethnicity-specific biological viruses that are going to attack the Russian population, whether or not that's a valid claim. Again, we're just trying to get into the minds of the Russians, because here's the flip. If the Russians think that NATO is getting ready to do a decapitation strike, and they have every reason to believe that, based on what I've told you, they have every reason to believe that. If you don't think that, then you're just naive or you're being disingenuous. The Russians have every reason to believe that we are probing their defenses because, trust me, the rapacious oligarchs in charge want nothing more than to have the tens, if not hundreds of trillions of dollars of resource wealth that are under the ground within that massive country. The temptation is so strong that they would be willing to sacrifice cities. And if Russia knows that, what's that old saying by Vladimir Putin? If you know a fight is coming, you be the one to throw the first punch. So the risk then is that Russia preempts our first strike by attacking first. So, ergo are the changes to its nuclear doctrine, changing the foundations of its state nuclear deterrence policy. Changes in Russia's nuclear doctrine will concern the foundations of the state nuclear deterrence policy. So these aren't just some cursory, surface level changes. This is changes to the foundation of the state nuclear deterrence policy, which historically has revolved around Russia will not be the first one to use nukes, and they will only use nukes if their existence depends on it, which is ambiguous, but they've lived up to it thus far, when you can make the argument that calling for the strategic defeat of Russia, be it economic, political, or military, is, in a sense, threatening their existence, right? So if you're going to defeat them economically so they can't recover, then that's a threat to their existence. So arguably, based on their own nuclear doctrine, they already would have been justified in using nuclear weapons. But now they're changing the foundation. How is it going to change? There is a military doctrine providing for two scenarios where the use of nuclear weapons is acceptable in military action against an enemy. As for the foundations of state nuclear deterrence, it's a document that specifies the options and conditions for these actions. Their focus is currently on the latter document. So, the options being what type of nuclear weapon will be used? Where will that nuclear weapon be used? What might the yield of said nuclear weapon be? What will the deployment system be? Where will it be launched from? Will it actually be used in the battlefield at all? Or will it just be a demonstrative strike? And then the conditions for those actions. What are the red lines? Now, they're talking about the focus being on the conditions. So what are going to be the trigger events that elicit the use of a nuclear weapon? The Russians are very judicious people. If they are changing their nuclear deterrence policy, that means that they're establishing a new and more well-defined red line. Okay? And that can only mean that they're starting to run out of options, and they see that they need to make this statement now as this ramps up exponentially. We have Poland claiming that they're going to shoot down missiles. The head of the Polish Foreign Ministry, get a load of this, Radoslaw Sikorski, said that Poland and other countries are obliged to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine. Not sit inside Poland, but over Ukraine. So this, of course, effectively would be a no-fly zone. Sikorski explained that Poland is obliged to ensure the safety of its citizens, despite fears that the interception of missiles over the territory of Ukraine could involve NATO in a war between Russia and Ukraine. So NATO and Poland will continue to push and push until Russia pushes back. That is their only strategy, is to continue to push, and Russia knows that if they don't establish this in writing, then, and especially if they do it in writing, then nobody can say there was any ambiguity about whether or not Russia was justified in their actions, whether we believe that the way their nuclear doctrine is written is justifiable or not. But when you think that the U.S. nuclear doctrine allows for a first strike, okay? So our nuclear doctrine, which when it happens, the media is just going to downplay, and they're going to say, well, that's different because, you know, we're a democracy and we believe in free speech, blah, blah, blah. Even though our nuclear doctrine is framed more aggressively than the Russians already, when the Russians do ultimately do this and do eventually drop a nuke, we know what the media is going to say. Okay, they're going to use that as an opportunity to be a rallying cry for war. And so this is what Russia is trying to postpone, because Russia knows as soon as they drop that first nuke, the Western media is just going to be all over it. In the same way that the Israelis are trying to goad the Iranians desperately into a war, because let's face it, you've seen all the people in Tel Aviv in the last couple nights. We've seen, just hundreds of thousands of people in the streets calling for hostages to be released and the ouster of Benjamin Netanyahu. So we know that they need an enemy in order to exist. They need the Iranians to attack them, and the West needs Russia to use a nuke against them. But it turns into a question of, okay, Russia can postpone that so long, but they can only do it for so long. Because Russia knows that strategically they are winning. They are starting to build their international relations with the countries that are going to do business with it in the future, while they might be a pariah state to the golden billion. To the rest of the world and to the BRICS countries, they can see through all of this, what's going on. So they know if they can just hold on a little bit longer until Ukraine breaks, then they will be able to win this without having to use nukes and deprive the West of the flashbulb event it needs to galvanize its population and descend into a full-blown war economy. But the problem is that they underestimate the tenacity of the West, the rapaciousness of our corporatocracy, in that we will not stop this progression. It might slow down if Trump gets elected. But remember, Trump was the one that pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was the biggest, most significant thing. And now they're already talking about putting nukes back in Germany once again in 2027. In addition to that, we also have Belarus firing drones from Ukraine. Now it's been alleged that they're allowing the Russians to fire their Shahed drones into Ukraine, so that's an escalation. We also have Ukraine using its first long-range missile drone, the Palyantia, for the first time against a military target in temporarily occupied Crimea. In terms of Crimea, and we're going to be jumping around a bit here because I want to make sure I cover everything. This image was a picture was taken in Crimea, and allegedly this is a part of their nuclear unit. So the rumor is that there are nuclear weapons inside Crimea. Let me see if I have the story about that. A military vehicle in the nuclear department of Russian MOD has been spotted in Crimea. 12th Main Directorate is engaged in the storage and maintenance of nuclear weapons. It also includes the Special Control Service, which monitors nuclear tests in other countries. So why do the Russians, are they moving nukes out? Are they moving nukes in? What does this picture even mean? Who knows? But something is brewing, okay? This nuclear doctrinal shift is incredibly significant. Now, the problem is, and Russia underestimates the degree to which, and so does the clique. I call them the clique. The McGregors, the Jeffrey Sachs, the Tucker Carlsons, the Scott Ritters, the Mark Slobodas, the... who else? The list goes on and on. The guys who always do the softball interviews. Basically, the problem with their thinking is they think that this war is just going to end and that Ukraine is just going to be defeated. And they've been saying it for the longest time. And I'm here to tell you, if you think that NATO is just going to stop, I mean, guess again, okay? Here is what Russian pundits are saying about Ukraine's ability to fight. This is the Russians now. The Russians are under no illusions about Ukraine's capability and NATO's capability to continue this war asymmetrically. And an asymmetrical war is even harder to fight. So even if the lines were stabilized along the Dnieper River and Ukraine continued to fire long-range missiles inside Russia proper, then, that's going to be even more of a pain in the ass than a frontline conflict in a lot of ways. As long as the Ukrainian Armed Forces logistics supply hubs and personnel training bases are in operation, which of course are present in the surrounding NATO countries, we will not be able to achieve a single tangible military victory in Ukraine. At this rate, the Ukrainian Armed Forces will be able to receive qualified reinforcements for any necessary amount of weapons for another 2 to 3 years. Despite the discrepancy in the amount of artillery shell production, okay? The Russians are still getting, remember, artillery shells from North Korea and ballistic missiles from Iran most recently. That's not infinite. There's some people who act like they can just keep doing that forever. Well, they can't. I mean, they can for a long time, don't get me wrong, and they could ramp up the war machine way more than it currently is. But so can NATO. They're saying that they can do this for at least another 2 to 3 years. When does that take us till? around 2027 when Germany is supposed to be getting their nukes back, their intermediate range nuclear weapons. The journalist believes that Moscow should strike NATO facilities on the territory of Nezalezhnia, and that's another term, I believe, for Ukraine. It's a derogatory term for Ukraine, I believe, in Russian, during the vote counting period during the U.S. presidential election. So all these pundits have their ways in which they believe the situation should be dealt with, and that's not what we're really looking at here. We're looking at what their point of view is in terms of the reality of the battlefield. Otherwise, the conflict could last for another 4 to 5 years. Geopolitical expert Yuri Baranchik shares a similar opinion. He believes that the alliance will give the Russian armed forces a pretext to attack using F-16 fighters. At the same time, even before the strike, Moscow should amend the doctrine of a preemptive strike against a nuclear and conventional threat, including against an enemy that does not have weapons of mass destruction. And this is where, it all starts to come together. Because in Russia's nuclear doctrine and the United States nuclear doctrine, it allows for strikes against countries that don't have possession of nuclear weapons, okay? So he's getting specific with respect to how he thinks that the Russians should alter the nuclear doctrine. So, again, this is why I think a lot of Western pundits who are critical, and rightly so, of the Western media circus that, keep pumping these NATO narratives, even though they're right about a lot of things, they persistently underestimate how insane NATO is. Always, they underestimate how insane NATO is. And if you think that part of the reason why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in the first place is because he didn't want them to get another nuke when they were threatening it, I mean, if we're talking about them now having the platforms for that, Poland having a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine, Ukraine getting long-range weapon systems actively inside Russia, regardless of whether or not they're getting their asses handed to them in Kursk or not, right? It doesn't matter, because really what's most important here is their deep strike capabilities, because that is what is going to slowly chip away at the Russian war machine over time. So this is problematic. And Russia would not be running to North Korea or Iran for advanced weapon systems if they were, invincible and indomitable in terms of their military production. They would not have to utilize North Korea and Iran. Now, some people are saying, well, they're doing that because they don't want to exhaust their good stuff. They're saving their good stuff for NATO. That may be the case, but, we're just assuming that, right? Russia and Iran are also working on a strategic partnership as we speak. We're still waiting. I think we'll be waiting for a while for the Iranian response. But what's going to happen now is that Netanyahu is going to be incentivized to create something else, is to do some sort of provocation, which is going to force Iran to take action. And it might be something far more drastic than what we've seen in the past. It'll probably be high-level assassinations on Iranian territory or something to that effect in order to elicit the same response as last time. Now, there are some rumors, and part of the reason why I say that, there might be a revolution in Ukraine is because allegedly what's happened right now, and part of the reason why the Eastern Front is collapsing, is because a lot of the hardcore guys who were enforcing, the military police of sorts who are enforcing the front line, are currently in Kursk. That's the rumor. Now, what I'm about to say, I can't prove 100%. This is hearsay, but it's from a very informed source. And they claim that in and along the trenches of the front, where a lot of the direct engagements are happening, what they tend to do is they put the conscripts there, the guys that they pull out of jail, the guys who try to dodge the draft, try to escape the country, the guys who, let me just see how much time I got left. The guys who are pulled off the streets against their will or commit a crime or, for whatever reason they think they're traitors, they put them in the shittiest, highest fatality rate zones. Now, in order to make sure they stay there and don't surrender to the Russians, because this is why, and this happens on both sides, arguably, both sides have people who are forced to be on the front line to fight, and they don't want to be there. And so they'll take whatever opportunity they can to try to surrender to the other side, right? Now, if you don't have guys to enforce that line, and there's rumors that people, if they leave the front, they get shot, okay? In fact, there's some video footage that shows that very thing. So the rumor is that this is what's happening right now. And this is part of the reason why those lines are collapsing, because a lot of those more seasoned veterans who were not the ones who were right in the trenches, but the ones tasked with shooting the guys if they either ran at the Russians in order to surrender or ran back in an attempt to go AWOL, those guys are currently operating in other places. So this is why the Eastern Front is collapsing. There's some more fairly underhanded and diabolical schemes that Ukraine is accused of, holding relatives of draft dodgers hostage. According to Zelensky, relatives will be held responsible for draft dodgers. Okay, Ukrainian Prime Minister presented a list of measures that will be applied not only to draft dodgers, but also to their close relatives, spouses, children, parents, sisters, brothers, grandfathers, and grandmothers. So talk about a draconian police state. No elections, and if you don't go and fight and die on the front, which there's a good chance that you're going to become a casualty of war, they're going to penalize your family members. In addition to that, there are claims that Ukraine is threatening to target the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant workers. According to Russian media, Ukraine is exerting pressure on the staff at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Russia with threats to, quote-unquote, kill their family members if they refuse to cooperate with Kiev. Very interesting times. War is brutal. There's no doubt about that. Oh yeah, China is building its own Starlink and plans to launch 15,000 satellites, sparking U.S. concerns. I guess when we do it, it's okay. This might be the strategy that they use for how they are going to staff the World War III front. British prisoners could soon be housed in Estonian jails after numbers in prison in England and Wales hit a record high of 88,000. What is the number in the US? I think it's went down, but at its peak it was like 3 million. Anyways, there's going to be two campaigns, I believe. One is going to be fight for your freedom. That's going to be the people who are given the choice of going to jail or going to fight on the front. And there's going to be fight for your citizenship. So if you're an immigrant and you come and you want to get citizenship, first you got to go do a few tours, if you know what I mean. I think this is how they're going to fill the ranks. Because we know all those fancy boys in District 1, they ain't fighting a war. And of course they're going to Estonia, which many people think could potentially be another front opening up at some point in the future, the way that they're talking about Russia's existential defeat as well. This was a video that was released by a supposed hacker who had hacked into a Russian water treatment center. And they have a bunch of these videos where they're showing these various schematics of how, all of the things in the power plants or the water treatment plants are controlled by computers. And if you go and you mess with the temperature of a certain thing, you can cause a problem, and that can create a chain reaction. And this is a Ukrainian hacker claiming that they're inside these systems. But, why would you broadcast this, especially if maybe this is old and they had already done the damage to this power system and the software, or it's already been air gapped or something like that. That's why they're sharing this. I can't see why they would show this if they're currently in said system, because then the Russians are just going to lock everything down, right? So I don't doubt that this is somewhat real, but take it with a grain of salt. I just wanted to comment on this map. Trump was tweeting this out, and just to, sometimes things like this, people don't look into it deep enough. But if you really think about it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yes, is China buying a significant amount of farmland? On the grand scheme of things, what do we mean by China? Is it Chinese corporations? Is it Chinese individuals? Is it the Chinese government? I mean, these are all different things, right? But the actual facts of the matter are that there's 400,000 acres that are currently owned by China in some way, shape, or form, whether individuals, corporations, or governments, or subsidiaries. And the United States actual land available is about 1.9 billion acres, okay? So to put it in perspective, that's about 0.02%. I think that the Chinese likely have sleeper cells in the United States. How could they not? They would be stupid not to. I think that TikTok is a scourge on society, and it is put there to dumb us down, which is why the Chinese make it illegal in their own country, but are glad to have our children brainwashed by it. I think that there's no doubt a lot of espionage and potential for attacks on critical infrastructure. And there's no doubt an attempt to try to get as much data on American military facilities as possible. But this is just silly, because no matter where you go, if you actually look at a map of the United States, like just go and Google, I don't have the map up here, but where the military bases are, they are everywhere. So no matter where you buy land, you're arguably not too far from a military base. And when you really look at the way this land is distributed, this is just nonsense. So this is just, is a red herring, if you ask me. Again, this is not to be naive to the fact that, yeah, China and America are probably going to go to war someday. And at some point, they may have to expropriate this from the Chinese. But, to say that, there's some guy in there with binoculars looking into the military base, I don't know. I mean, do they even need to do that in order to do that is the question. Could there be some drone activity? Or maybe. But again, there's so many military bases all over the place that I just think that this is slightly overblown, which is not to say it's a nothing burger, but it's also, it's one of these things which makes for a good headline, but is there really a lot to worry about there? I think we have bigger things to worry about. Take a look at this, guys. I released over the weekend a video talking about what I call the Reference and Identification Portfolio, the RIP, the RIP. You should have all of your documentation. If the shit hits the fan. Somebody made a snarky comment, oh, full-blown shit hits the fan, you're not going to need any of this. Well, while it might be true that there is no more government, how are you going to prove your identity to someone else? You're likely only going to be able to live in like a shut-in for so long. So if you need to prove your identity to someone else, how are you going to prove your credentials? How are you going to prove that you're not a criminal? How are you going to prove that you own a certain property? Okay, so you have to have your documentation in addition to other reference material. But I showed off this paper in that video, and everybody around the warehouse, we were blown away by this paper. We've been selling this stuff for years, and I never actually realized how good it was. This is called Duracopy paper, okay? This is damn near indestructible paper. You don't even need to laminate your documents. It is entirely waterproof. In fact, you could stuff underwater, completely submersible, and get a load of this. I don't want to toot my horn, but I got a pretty good grip strength. And I can't rip this. I got a challenge for you. Buy some Duracopy paper from CanadianPreparedness.com. Try to rip it in half. Okay, find a strong man in your area. See they can rip it in half. It will cut, okay? It'll cut, but it won't rip. Good luck ripping it. It's not gonna rip. And it's just incredibly durable paper. So you can print maps on this. You can make copies of your ID, stuff for your bug out bag. It's something to think about anyways. There isn't a video or isn't a concept in prepping that we haven't touched on this channel over the years. So please go and watch the blue strip content, because I don't want people to be marooned when SHTF because all you did was watch doom porn videos about how bad things are and how bad they're going to get. You need the motivation, I get that. You need the information, I get that, but you got to be pairing it with the practical steps. And quite frankly, myself, I watched a Praxis Prepper video the other day, and you know, he reminded me of something that I talked about probably a couple years ago. And it's that in most cases, we only push ourselves maybe 50% in terms of our potential. You know, like when you're out working in the sun and you're doing maybe a job, it could just be a hobby, it could be something that you got to get done. Most people will give up long before they really have to, right? We throw in the towel way too early. And I'd say lately, despite the fact that I'm working 16 hours a day, I feel as though I'm only given like 65%, not because I'm not putting in the time, but I'm not focused. And if you focus, and if you really try to make use of your time and not get distracted, and a lot of it has to do with the phone and social media, you really got to turn it off. But you would be amazed at how much you can achieve if you just put your mind to it and get to work. Because a lot of the time is just spent pissing around. And most people, when they say, oh, you know, there's no way you can build out a homestead in this amount of time. Sure you can. Just work till 1 in the morning every day. Oh, that's too hard. You want work-life balance? Well, then guess what? Yeah, then you're not going to do it. But if you want to get ahead, if you want to get an edge, then you got to put in the work. So there is no excuse for people not to be able to go and do what everybody eventually does when they're a prepper, and that's get a rural property. Rural property is cheaper. Does it take more time? Yes, but it's cheaper than what you'll find in the city because it's further from the city, and it doesn't even need to be a property that you live on immediately. You just got to get something, okay? Just get something and start to work with it. Work with that something, and that has intrinsic value, okay? Whereas property in the city, when you're surrounded in a densely populated region and there's no more supply chain, there is zero intrinsic value. Maybe there's some people in the suburbs that got big enough yards and they have, you know, a greenhouse operation, and you can do a lot with a 1/4 acre or 1/2 acre. You can grow a lot of food if you're smart and you do it right. But most people, you know, especially being so close in proximity, there's security risks. So seize upon the opportunity right now. We live in a society that thinks that nuclear war is further away than ever before, when really it's closer than ever before. That same inverted principle is present in the real estate market, whereas the best properties to survive SHTF right now are the cheapest properties. Okay? When the shit hits the fan, they're going to be the most expensive, not in terms of monetary value, but in terms of you're probably going to get shot if you go on them. So start looking for land right now, or start looking for a place to bug out to. Go watch the videos that we did with Curtis Stone, where he gives you some tips on what you can do in order to, if you don't have the resources to buy land, there's other things you can do, okay? And I'm not going to get into them in this video, but there's a lot of possibilities. So I'll post links to that in the description below. I'd encourage you to go and watch that video. Do yourself a favor, guys. Please. People complain, oh, your titles are too alarmist, and then those same people never once will comment on the hundreds of videos where we try to just provide education to people. So I guess some people just like to complain, and unfortunately, those are going to be the first people to die when the shit hits the fan. They can't say that they weren't warned. Let me know what you think about the preemptive strike, first strike hypothesis, the decapitation strike hypothesis, and these unmanned aerial vehicle strikes as probing operations for NATO. Thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. If you want the t-shirt, CanadianPreparedness.com. Thanks for watching.